4 missile salvos hit Tel Aviv in 40 minutes. Not one strike, not a single dramatic explosion that the cameras could frame and the anchors could narrate. 4 separate, coordinated, deliberately sequenced waves of ballistic missiles, back to back to back to back, engineered with one specific purpose: to drain every interceptor battery defending central Israel before the real warhead arrived. This is what Wave 80 looks like. 80 waves of ballistic missile attacks in 26 consecutive days. And the question that every American taxpayer deserves a direct answer to, because your money is paying for every single interceptor being fired into that sky, is this: how much longer can Israel's shield hold? And what happens to all of us when it doesn't? This is not a story about a distant war. This is a story about a defense architecture that America built, America funds, and America is now watching get ground down in real time. And if you think the bill for this war stops at Israel's borders, you have not been paying attention to your gas pump, your grocery bill, or your retirement account lately. Subscribe right now and stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is the kind of analysis that the major networks have completely abandoned in favor of talking points and sanitized briefings. Now let me walk you through exactly what happened over Tel Aviv, because the details matter and the official version leads out the parts that should alarm you most. The 4 salvos were not simply timed close together. They were designed as a system. Each wave served a function within the overall attack architecture. The first wave forces the activation of interceptors. The second wave forces more. The third wave forces more still. And by the time the 4th wave arrives, the batteries defending central Tel Aviv have been partially depleted, their engagement capacity reduced, their operators under sustained pressure, their resupply cycle disrupted. This is called saturation strategy, and it works. Israeli Army radio confirmed explosions across the city. Sirens tore through residential neighborhoods in the middle of the night. Civilians ran for bomb shelters in darkness and confusion. Authorities reported injuries, no deaths this time. And I want to be very clear about what no deaths means in this context, because it does not mean the attack failed. It means the attack achieved its operational purpose, demonstrating that the layered defense system can be pressured toward exhaustion without needing to kill anyone to prove the point. In parts of Tel Aviv, warning systems failed entirely. 0 seconds of warning before impact. None. A warhead carrying approximately 100 kilograms of high explosive detonated between apartment buildings in central Tel Aviv. Police confirmed the impact site. 6 people were pulled from 4 separate blast sites across the city while rescue crews worked through a collapsed residential block looking for anyone still alive beneath the rubble. That is not a successful defense. That is a partially successful defense under conditions that are getting harder to manage with every passing day. And those conditions are getting harder because of one specific weapon that changed the strategic equation of this entire conflict. And that weapon is the Sagil 2. This missile was fired in combat for only the 2nd time in history on March 15th. And what it does to conventional air defense planning is genuinely alarming. The Sagil 2 is an 18-meter, 2-stage, solid-fuel ballistic missile. It weighs 23.6 tons at launch, 5 to 6 times heavier than Iran's Fateh hypersonic system. Depending on the distance to target, it delivers either a 700-kilogram warhead at ranges out to 2,000 kilometers or a 1.5-ton warhead at closer targets. Every square centimeter of Israeli territory falls comfortably within that engagement envelope. But the weight and the range are not what makes this missile dangerous. What makes this missile dangerous is the solid fuel propellant and the flight behavior during re-entry. With liquid fuel missiles, older systems like the Shahab 3, launch crews have to spend several minutes pumping propellant into the airframe before firing. Those minutes are a window. That window is when you find the missile on its launcher and destroy it before it ever leaves the ground. The Sagil 2 eliminates that window entirely. It rolls out of a mobile transporter erector launcher and fires almost immediately. There is no fueling window to exploit, no exposed preparation sequence, no warning before launch that gives you time to act. And then, once it's in the air, Israeli and American analysts have described its re-entry flight path as erratic. It shifts and adjusts during descent in ways specifically designed to defeat the tracking algorithms built into Israel's Arrow 3 interceptor system and David's Sling. The guidance system confuses the very mathematical models that those interceptors use to calculate an intercept solution. And Iran is not firing the Sagil-2 in isolation. During Wave 54 of this campaign, the IRGC paired the Sagil-2 with the Khorramshahr missile, which carries dual warheads alongside Khaybar Shakan, Ghadar, and Ahmad missiles, all in a single mixed salvo. Different speeds, different altitudes, different trajectories, different radar cross-sections, all arriving within overlapping engagement windows, forcing Israel's defense layers to simultaneously manage multiple threat profiles that no single interceptor system was designed to handle alone. But here is the dimension of this conflict that the American media has almost entirely ignored. And it is the dimension that reveals the true strategic depth of what Iran is executing. This is not a campaign designed to flatten Tel Aviv. It is a campaign designed to make Israel functionally unlivable through sustained infrastructure destruction. While the world's cameras focused on apartment buildings and injury counts, Iranian ballistic missiles struck the vicinity of the Orot Rabin power station near Hadera, approximately 45 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. This facility is the single largest power generation plant in Israel. It produces 2,590 megawatts of electricity, roughly 20% of the entire country's power output flowing through one location. The strikes triggered widespread blackouts across Tel Aviv's suburbs and surrounding central districts. Entire neighborhoods plunge into complete darkness simultaneously, captured in eyewitness footage that spread across social media, while Israeli officials declined to confirm the full scope of grid damage. Additional missiles struck the Bazan Group oil refineries in Haifa Bay, Israel's primary refining complex. And this was not the first time those refineries had been hit. Iran had already targeted the same facilities in earlier waves. That repetition is not random. It is deliberate. It is a pressure test. Repeated strikes on the same energy nodes to measure Israel's repair capacity, to exhaust its maintenance crews, to force it to divert resources from military operations to civilian infrastructure restoration. Iran's energy minister made the doctrinal logic explicit when he stated publicly that Iran generates power across more than 150 decentralized plants nationwide, then added that Israel and Gulf states concentrate production in a small number of facilities that are, and he used these exact words, centralized and very vulnerable. The IRGC reinforced that message with a direct operational warning. If you hit electricity, we hit electricity. That is not a threat. That is a published military doctrine. Iran is telling Israel openly, on the record, that every strike on Iranian power infrastructure will be answered with strikes on Israeli power infrastructure, where one successful hit removes 20% of national generating capacity rather than a fraction of a percent. If you are still watching at this point, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you represents a genuine escalation in the logic of this war, one that removes any remaining illusion that civilian infrastructure and civilian lives are protected by the rules of engagement that both sides are claiming to follow. On March 24th, the IRGC's intelligence unit published a formal operational statement declaring that Israeli civilian shelters are now legitimate military targets. Not a vague warning, not heated rhetoric from a spokesperson. A published, documented operational statement claiming that Iran holds the architectural blueprints, the GPS coordinates, and the structural specifications of Israel's entire civilian shelter network, including the Mamad reinforced safe rooms built directly into Israeli residential buildings, with 20 to 30 centimeter concrete walls and blast-resistant steel doors. Think about what that means. The rooms that Israeli families run to when the sirens sound. The rooms where parents hold their children while missiles travel overhead. Iran says it has the coordinates for all of them. And then consider what came before that statement, because this is not an idle claim. On March 1st, an Iranian missile punched straight through two interceptors, two separate interceptions that both failed, and struck a communal shelter inside a synagogue in Beit Shemesh, 18 miles from Jerusalem. 9 civilians died, 49 were wounded. That remains the single deadliest strike of this entire war. And 2 weeks after that, on March 17th, hours after Israel assassinated Iranian security chief Ali Larijani, the IRGC fired cluster munition warheads at central Israel. One of those warheads struck an apartment building in Ramat Gan, just east of Tel Aviv. A couple in their 70s were killed. They were found just outside their reinforced safe room, just outside it. They didn't make it in time. Or the safe room didn't save them. We don't fully know which, but we know they are dead. So when the IRGC says it will target shelters, it is not performing for domestic audiences. It is making a statement backed by a demonstrated operational capability to reach exactly what it says it will reach. This is where I need every American watching this to pay very close attention, because what I'm about to lay out is the financial reality of this war, the part that connects directly to your wallet, your family's economic security, and the long-term military capacity of the United States. And it is a reality that official Washington has been extraordinarily reluctant to state plainly. An Iranian ballistic missile costs between $200,000 and $500,000 to manufacture. One missile. That is the cost Iran pays to put a threat in the air over Tel Aviv. An Arrow 3 interceptor, Israel's highest tier defense system, costs between $2 million and $3 million per shot. David's Sling runs approximately $1 million each. The American THAAD system, which Washington has deployed heavily into this theater, costs $13 million per interceptor. $13 million for one interceptor against one missile that costs $300,000 to build. Israel is spending between 4 and 26 times more per engagement than Iran is spending to create the engagement. Now multiply that ratio across 80 waves over 26 consecutive days, and you begin to understand why a senior Israeli defense official went on the record to say what nobody in this administration wanted to hear. Even if production is ramped up immediately, what you are firing today is what was ordered 2 or 3 years ago. The pipeline is not there to replenish at this rate. The United States burned through approximately 14% of its entire THAAD stockpile in the first 2 weeks of this conflict. 14% of the total American THAAD inventory, gone in 14 days. Current production rates deliver roughly 12 THAAD interceptors per year. Replenishing what was consumed in those first 14 days would take between 3 and 8 years at current manufacturing capacity. 3 to 8 years to replace what was fired in half a month. If you found yourself genuinely shocked by those numbers, then you understand exactly why this analysis matters and why the mainstream media's failure to report it clearly is a genuine disservice to the American public. Subscribe right now and share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening. Because the decisions being made in Washington right now will affect this country's military posture and economic health for the next decade. Now let me show you the full scope of what this war has already done to the global economy and what it is going to keep doing to ordinary Americans if it continues on its current trajectory. Before the first strike on February 28th, Brent crude oil was trading at approximately $72 to $87 per barrel. As of this week, it has been swinging between $100 and $110, having spiked near $120 in the opening 2 weeks. Dubai crude hit an all-time high above $150. Oman crude settled above $152. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas flows, has been severely disrupted since early March. The International Energy Agency described this as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Gulf oil production has dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day. The IEA released 400 million barrels from emergency reserves, the largest such release ever executed. The United States committed 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Prices have barely moved. California gasoline crossed $5 per gallon in the second week of March and has not come back down. Fertilizer prices, specifically urea and nitrogen compounds, a large share of which transit through Hormuz, are on track to roughly double if this conflict drags on. Brazil, which supplies nearly 60% of global soybean exports, depends on fertilizer shipments that move through that same strait. The agricultural supply chain disruption from this war will show up in American grocery store prices within months if Hormuz remains compromised. And this is all happening against the backdrop of an interception campaign that is costing Israel an estimated $200 million per day to sustain. per day. That number does not even include American defense contributions, American logistics support, or the cost of repositioning U.S. naval assets in the theater. The combined interception rate of approximately 92%, which the headlines keep presenting as evidence that the defense is working, means that 8% of Iranian missiles are reaching populated areas. 8% of 440 ballistic missiles fired since February 28th is roughly 35 warheads that reach their targets. 35 unintercepted impacts across 26 days, some carrying cluster munition warheads that scatter dozens of individual submunitions at altitude, forcing Iron Dome to chase each fragment separately. An Israeli brigadier general described his system's capability against those cluster warheads with exactly 3 words: better than nothing. That is the quote. That is the honest assessment from the man responsible for operating the system. Better than nothing. That is what $13 million THAAD interceptors and years of American defense investment have produced against an enemy that has been firing every single day for nearly a month straight. So here is the question that this entire situation forces us to confront. And it is a question that no one in official Washington has been willing to answer directly, honestly, or with the urgency it demands. What happens when the interceptors run out before the missiles do? What is the contingency plan when the arithmetic of this conflict, an arithmetic that is not speculative, not theoretical, but grounded in documented expenditure rates and documented production capacity, reaches its logical conclusion? What does it look like when a nation of 9 million people, whose civilian shelter system has been publicly mapped and targeted by its adversary, loses the defensive shield that has been the single factor preventing mass casualty events from an 80-wave ballistic missile campaign? And what does it cost the United States in treasure, in strategic credibility, in military readiness for other contingencies around the world to keep funding a defense that is consuming years of production capacity in weeks? These are not rhetorical questions designed to generate outrage. These are the specific, concrete, operational questions that the people running this war need to answer, and answer publicly to the American taxpayers who are footing an enormous portion of the bill. The IRGC launched its 80th wave of ballistic missiles on the same day Israeli officials declared Iran's military capacity to be degraded. The same day. Degraded enough to fire wave 80. Degraded enough to keep the Strait of Hormuz disrupted. Degraded enough to put oil above $100 per barrel globally. Degraded enough to push American fertilizer-dependent food prices toward a crisis point that will hit the middle of this country. The farmers, the working families, the people living paycheck to paycheck who cannot absorb a doubling of food costs, with a force that no one in the corridors of power in Washington will feel personally. The people making the decisions that are burning through $13 million interceptors at unsustainable rates do not fill their own gas tanks. They do not calculate whether they can afford fertilizer for next season's crop. They do not sit in a Tel Aviv apartment building and listen to sirens fail to activate before a warhead detonates between their home and their neighbor's home. The people who feel the consequences of these decisions are the ones who never get a seat at the table where the decisions are made. That is what makes this war, like every war, a story about power. About who has it, who exercises it, who pays for the exercise of it, and who bears the cost when the strategy fails to achieve the outcomes that justified the price. 80 waves, 26 days. An interceptor stockpile being depleted at a rate that takes years to replenish. A civilian population living under daily bombardment. A global economy absorbing a supply shock that the International Energy Agency has called historically unprecedented. And a strategic situation in which the side spending $300,000 per missile has demonstrated across 80 consecutive waves that it can sustain this campaign indefinitely, while the side spending $13 million per interception is racing against the clock of its own inventory. The question is not who is winning. Wars at this stage are rarely about who is winning. The question is what the end game looks like, who pays for it, and whether the people in power are being honest with the rest of us about where this is actually heading. They are not being honest. And that is why this conversation has to happen outside the official briefings, outside the sanitized press releases, outside the network coverage that treats a 92% interception rate as a headline without ever asking what the 8% means over time. This is what accountability journalism looks like in the middle of a crisis that is reshaping the world in real time. And if you believe that the public deserves this kind of reporting, direct, documented, consequence-focused, and completely independent of the talking points coming out of any government or any political party, then subscribe, leave a comment telling me what question about this war you think is going completely unanswered by the major media, and share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening before the next wave lands.